Welcome, everyone. After this morning's coughing session, it's entirely appropriate that we have one of the world's experts. I can also reveal here that we actually have a young lady whose first seminar it is, which I think is really exciting. And as the professor of cuteness as well, you know, and the world's expert, I think that's 11 out of 10.
Wow. Wow.
So, but what she'll learn about today, of course, is really exciting. I mean, I think I know of no other person who has the breadth of interest, the breadth of science that really, I think, has elucidated a lot about what it is that we know and what we come to know about how the brain works on drugs. So I'm really excited about what you will tell us today, and especially the link to cognition. I mean, many people, of course, think that drugs are not really necessarily doing anything to cognition, but I'm sure you will convince us otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So it gives me great pleasure. Jan, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Morten, for the kind words, and also thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come to Oxford. I'm not alone here, by the way, as you have noted. Pablo Malagoni and Natasha Mason are sitting in the back. And a lot of the work that I will share with you today actually comes from their hands, and it's the data that they collected and they analyzed. So today, I'm going to talk about what I call neuromodulations and neuroadaptations called by drugs. And with neuromodulations, I'm more referring to like the acute effects of drugs which they have on the brain. And with neuroadaptations, I'm more referring to what happens on the longer term. Now, either you take a drug once and that does change things in your brain at a longer perspective, or if you're a chronic user of drugs, how does that change, how does that adapt your brain? So by training, we're all psychologists at the Maastricht University, at least our department. We're all psychologists by training, so hence that's also why we have this strong interest in cognitive function and neurocognition. See, he's laughing already, you know, psychology. Yeah. And but from that, we kind of developed this interest in pharmacology, which we just learned by experience, I would say. So we are now the Department of Psychopharmacology in Maastricht. This is a picture of our website. And we have a lot of, we have a couple of research lines that are more focused on type of compounds that we're interested in. And I won't share all of them with you today, but you know, we have a strong interest in cannabis. We have an interest in cognition enhancers as such. We're also interested in novel psychoactive substances. These are like the cheap substances you can buy on the internet and that are trying to replace the traditional highs that people would tend to be using. Psychedelics, of course. And and we're also interested in stress and the brain. So, but primarily, I think, partly because of our background, we are trained in measuring behavior and cognition. So that's most of the work, if you look at it, was really clinical drug trials where we tried to measure the impact of a compound on the cognitive function. And so I give you some examples here. So this is some work that we did in the past together with Kim Kuipers, in 2005 already, it's almost like an age ago, where we were one of the first to sort of check the claim back then that MDMA, a single dose of MDMA is neurotoxic. Right? That was the narrative back then, based on studies in rodents. So we thought, well, you know, let's try and find out. So we set up this study. We gave a single dose of MDMA. We had a comparator drug called Ritalin, methylphenidate, and we measured the acute impact on memory directly, and we saw what we expected. There was an impairment during the intoxication phase of MDMA, and then we asked them to come back a day later, right? And if there was really like damage and neurotoxic effects, we would have expected that on the second day, you know, we would find the same thing, but we didn't. You know, it actually returned back to baseline. So from there we concluded, okay, you know, that the neurotoxic story is really not the entire story. It's not entirely true. And which is still relevant today, right? There's MDMA therapies, but people take MDMA only once or twice, right? And from studies like these, we now know that, no, that's actually safe to take. We're also interested in aggression. So we did some study to compare the impact of cannabis and alcohol on aggression. Alcohol, of course, as we know, increases aggression, right? And cannabis, you know, does the opposite. Almost like an open door, right? We all know it. but nobody had actually demonstrated that this happens. We're also, tonight, we're going to visit Amanda Fielding. We have collaborated with her. She's a strong believer in microdosing, but others would say, well, it's because you believe in microdosing that you experience effects, right? So, and we set up some controlled studies. I will also show you some other ones where we actually demonstrated that some of these claims are actually true. And some of these claims, and particularly in stimulatory effects, like increments in attention, do actually occur at least during the acute intoxication phase, which is pretty long if you take LSD. Even when you take a microdose of LSD, it's like 12 hours or even more. We're interested in novel psychoactive substances. So there are substitutes for cannabis, for example, like synthetic cannabinoids. And these are pure agonists of the CB1 receptor in the brain, whereas cannabis is a partial agonist. So the effects of the synthetic cannabinoids are much stronger than you would expect from cannabis. So, and particularly in terms of psychomimetic effects, you see that these effects are a lot bigger. So by doing this comparative research, we are able to sort of better quantify and qualify the differences between similar compounds that belong to the same chemical group. And this is our pride and joy, I think, in terms of applied sciences. We actually measure how drugs, medicinal drugs, or drugs of abuse impact your driving performance. And I think we kind of developed like the golden standard for that. And it's an on-the-road test where you have people smoke cannabis, put them behind the wheel, have them drive for 100 kilometers over a primary highway and measure their weaving motion. And the weaving motion is a very sensitive index of your control over the vehicle. And it's very sensitive to things like fatigue, depression, but also to fatigue induced by drugs, for example. So that has become like a golden standard over time. Yeah, so that's the behavioral side, but we are also interested in the more biological neural side. So which brain processes are driving these behavioral changes that we are observing? And we've had a particular focus, I would say, for a while at least, on the mesocorticolimbic circuit, otherwise known as the reward circuit. And I think the reason is that it is one of the prime circuits, networks in the brain that's sensitive to almost any drug of abuse or maybe use these days. And for example, cannabis is known to affect the reward system quite strongly, even though it's not a dopaminergic agonist, at least not directly, but indirectly it does, because it binds to presynaptic receptors of the glutamate and GABAergic neurons, and by doing so, it actually increases dopaminergic input into the VTA and into the nucleus accumbens, like the striatum, and then that's where the entire loop actually enters. Stimulants, alcohol, we know that they actually increase dopamine in the striatum. They do even more, but that's one of the central key points. And even psychedelics have an impact on that particular circuit, not necessarily because they increase dopamine in the striatum, but the 5-HT2A receptors are very well located in the prefrontal cortex. So it has an effect on the same circuit, but at a different entrance point. So these are the compounds that I would like to talk about a little bit today. And also we know the circuit from, we type it as the reward circuit, that's actually being involved in a lot more than just a reward. And if you look into the literature, you find that the circuit is actually relevant to support a kind of a lot of cognitive processes, such as psychomotor function or attention, learning, memory, but also in general, consciousness is very much related to that particular circuit. And that's where it becomes interesting, because changes in this circuit we can actually measure to a certain degree, right? We can use fMRI, functional connectivity. We can put seeds anywhere we want and see how these relate to any other areas in that particular circuit. Natasha has done a lot of that particular work. We can also use spectroscopy, so that's a method that we are particularly interested in our department, because that's a way to quantify neurotransmitters like glutamate and GABA. And it would be great if you could actually relate those to changes at a more functional level. And there's PET imaging, of course, although we don't do that too much ourselves, but it's actually quite relevant because it gives you information on the receptors to which particular drugs actually bind. So for the first part of my talk, I will focus a little bit on this circuit and the imaging method that has been used to sort of elaborate the function of these circuits. But before we go there, I would like to bring back in memory some of the theoretical work based with science that was already published almost like 15 years ago. This is Wolfram Schulz, I think he's in Cambridge at the moment, right? Who really demonstrated that the striatum in particular is sensitive to reward and learning. And I've taken this pictogram of his because I think it's actually quite exemplary for how it works. So basically what the theory tells you is that if you have no expectation of reward, then the impact of the actual reward will be big. And I think that's what you're looking at here. So there's no predictor, there's no stimulus, you didn't expect it, there it comes, it could be anything, right? And you have a big dopaminergic increase in dopaminergic activity in the striatum. So that's the reward. But after that, you learn from that, right? So the next time the predictor comes, the reward may be completely gone because you expected it to come. So the impact of that same rewarding stimulus becomes actually less. And if the prediction actually becomes higher than the actual reward, you will find that the dopaminergic activation in this striatum actually goes down, becomes negative. And this is a mechanism that we now have recognized to actually underlie learning, and learning in the context of reward, but actually it can be applied to any surrounding and environment. So basically it is as soon as you expect the reward and the expectation is as high as the actual reward, well, there's no dopaminergic stimulation anymore. If the actual reward is higher, you still have this activation. If it's less, then you have a downregulation. And this is an interesting mechanism that has been shown in animals with electrophysiological studies. And the question is, what's driving that mechanism? So why is your response to reward changing? And one of the proposals for that comes from Anthony Grace and others that are saying, well, it's the interaction between a phasic response to a stimulus and the tonic dopaminergic levels that are present in certain neurons that are driving that change. And basically the tonic dopamine levels, they are sort of the equivalent of your expectancy, your upfront expectancy, whereas the phasic dopaminergic response is how you respond to the actual stimulus. So we were interested to sort of put this theory or this idea to the test in a human fMRI study. So we designed this reward paradigm, or well, we didn't design the paradigm, but we used it, where people are looking at, they have a choice, right? You see this number 5, 25, and you can pick either one of those. And then either you get the amount that you selected, or it's a little bit bigger, so a bigger reward, or it's extremely much higher. So all of a sudden you get 125 rather than 25. But it could also go the opposite way, right? You can also have 125 losses while I was expecting a gain. So you have both sides of the expectancy that you can manipulate. And but the interesting point of the study was that we used methylphenidate, so a dopaminergic agonist, to actually interfere with the tonic dopamine levels. So we increased it by giving this compound to healthy volunteers. And that's an interesting way of manipulating the expectancy level, right, the tonic dopamine. And so when you're looking at the results actually here, so to the left, you see the placebo and the expectancy response, so prior to actually receiving feedback on your selection. And to the right, you see the same response in the methylphenidate condition. There you already see that the dopaminergic response is much higher. So the expectancy is higher because of the increased levels of dopamine. Now, then the next question is, okay, so we have raised the tonic dopamine, but then how does that affect your basic response to the feedback that you get, either the reward or the losses that you will sustain? And that's actually depicted here. So on the left here, you see the placebo conditions and all the possible rewards that you can have, right? You can have like a big reward, like 125, or you can have a big loss, 125. And typically what you see is that in a placebo condition where you get a big reward, where you did not expect it, you have this big increase in bold activation, right? That's a basic dopaminergic response. But then onto the right, and these are the gray bars, that's the methylphenidate condition. So we raise the tonic dopamine levels, we raise the expectancy, and now all of a sudden the basic dopamine response switches. It actually becomes negative. So that's almost like a mechanism that you can use to we talked about, right? Like treating the priors of people. And this is also a mechanism that is quite relevant in the field of addiction. So we thought that's an interesting idea. And the next study that we did was, okay, so if we provide people with stimuli that are principally rewarding, could we then use these tonic dopamine levels to actually decrease the actual reward that comes from that? So we set up this study where we exposed people to marketing cues, like movies of alcohol, and we created our own movies of cannabis because they do not really exist. So I'm gonna give you this example here, I hope. We had a nice movie that attracted you to the use of cannabis. So then we looked at the bold responses in the condition where they were only looking at the advertisement. So an advertisement for alcohol or an advertisement for cannabis or a neutral advertisement. And we had three groups. We had alcohol users, we had cannabis users, we had control users. The alcohol using group, they received placebo and alcohol as their active condition. The cannabis group, they received placebo and cannabis as their active condition. And the controls, then they were controls. They didn't receive any rewards at all. And typically what you see in both groups, so the alcohol marketing group and the cannabis group, there's this increase in brain activation, not only in the striatum, but all across the brain, basically. And that's the upper part, right, where you see the red coloring. And then if you look at the active condition, where people were actually under the influence of either alcohol or cannabis, you see again that this downregulation almost. So the activity actually decreased quite a lot relative to the actual marketing condition, indicating that the impact of the marketing movies were much less. And if you actually looked at the percentage of signal change in these conditions, and so in the striatum, I must add, then you see that in the alcohol group, which is part here, who were looking at the alcohol marketing movies, like the gray bars, you see that the signal change is actually much less in the alcohol group when they actually after drinking alcohol. And in the cannabis group, just the other way around. They didn't respond too much to the alcohol movies, but when they were looking at the cannabis movies, their signal response was much less than they were actually intoxicated. So so what do we take from this? There is this interaction between tonic and phasic dopamine. The conclusion is probably not that people should drink every day so that they are less sensitive to the marketing, but it does indicate that you could think of ways to increase the tonic dopamine levels, for example, with Ritalin, right? As long as you don't shoot it directly into your vein, it's not too addictive, but depending on the route of administration, it would actually work fine. So Ritalin is one of these compounds that is actually also being investigated in this context. So then finally, in terms of tonic dopamine, it also depends on who you are and what your genetic makeup is. And for example, we have this enzyme that's called dopamine beta hydroxylase that is responsible for converting dopamine into noradrenaline. And there are several genotypes, and everybody is the carrier of a certain genotype. So some of these genotypes, they're actually low active. So these the TT genotypes, which means that you're high on tonic levels of dopamine and lower on tonic levels of noradrenaline. Whereas with other genotypes, the CC one, you would be actually that are highly active, you would be relatively low on dopamine. And then we get to this famous U curve, right? The inverted U curve, right? Depending on where you are on that particular curve, that might actually affect the input of a dopaminergic manipulation. Because too much is always like a bad thing, right? It should be somewhere in the middle. So we were interested to see how carriers of the TT genotypes would respond to a dopaminergic manipulation relative to the CC carriers. And we gave them a lot of tasks, but we were primarily interested in impulse control. And typically what we see here, if you have an impulse control task, a cognitive impulse control task, that there's an increase in impulsivity in the people that are treated with cocaine, and to a certain degree actually also with cannabis, if you compare that to placebo. And if you, for example, look at the number of errors, you see that to the right, that increases, and also the latency increases. But that effect is the biggest in the carriers of the TT genotype. So those that were already high on tonic levels of dopamine, they actually that suffer from the fact that you increase this tonic levels even more. So there's the max to which you can actually increase those. And we saw that in the behavioral data set, but we actually also saw it in our functional connectivity data set. And here you're looking at the comparisons of cannabis versus placebo, cocaine versus placebo. And we use functional connectivity of the nucleus accumbens relative to the rest of the brain. So we placed this seed in the nucleus accumbens and saw how it was connected to other parts of the brain. And there we see this decrement, which you actually see a lot with dopaminergic agents. But we see it in particular for the carriers of TT individuals, so those who had high levels of dopamine already. But we didn't actually see it in the other group. So your genetic makeup matters a lot in terms of how you respond to actually a manipulation with a drug. And then, another way to actually increase tonic dopamine is with cannabis, even though we know it's not like this direct agonist, but it does it so indirectly. And this is where we come into the work that Natasha has been working on a lot, but also Pablo. So we designed studies in the scanner where we were interested to get an idea of the pharmacodynamic changes in people who are inhaling cannabis. So normally what you do is you smoke a cigarette and then you measure. But here we actually wanted them to be in the scanner, to lie in the scanner and inhale cannabis. So we adjusted the vaporizer apparatus a little bit, made it all of plastic so that it would actually be safe in the scanner. And we had this bag in which we collected the vapor for cannabis. I'm not sure whether you can see it on the picture below, but the bag was sort of lying on your belly, and it had a tube attached. From that, you could actually inhale the cannabis while you were lying in the scanner, which is important because cannabis is a psychoactive drug that works really, really fast, right? Within a minute, you have your peak experience almost already, and you don't want to miss that in the context of a study like this. And in this particular context, we were interested in functional connectivity being affected by cannabis, but we are particularly interested also in one aspect of cannabis use that many people talk about, and which is cognitive impairment. And cognitive impairment, we know that it exists, that it can occur in users, depending a little bit on your cannabis use history. And sometimes in a legal context, it's actually quite relevant. Think about the driving test that I've shown you in the beginning, right? There's a lot of debate worldwide. Okay, if somebody's positive for cannabis, should we lose his license? Should be taken off the road? And there is no test, no measurement at present to indicate is somebody actually impaired. So somebody may be positive for cannabis, but we don't know whether somebody is actually impaired. And we don't know even the mechanism that's underlying this. So we are really interested in studying the mechanism that produces impairment and separate it from those users that are maybe intoxicated but do not show impairment. So in order to get a level of idea of cognitive impairment, we had a psychomotor vigilance test that you're looking at here. It's a very simple basic task, right? You have this white dot, and if it changes color, you press a button. And it's a very easy and simple task, and you usually don't make any errors at all. But if you're slower, if your response is slower than 500 milliseconds, that's what we call a lapse of attention. And this is actually a test that comes from sleep research quite a lot, that has been shown to be very sensitive to processes that induce fatigue. So we have this as our ground truth, basically, of a level of impairment in individuals. And in this study, so we looked at spectroscopy, so to measure glutamate, also GABA. We looked at functional connectivity, which is the functional connectivity of the nucleus accumbens to the rest of the brain, because the nucleus accumbens is like the input for dopaminergic change. So it's an indirect marker of change in dopamine signaling. And we looked at attention, so the psychomotor vigilance cells. And we had two groups, occasional users, so these are your regular students who every now and then smoke a joint, and we had chronic users. And these are the people that smoke cannabis very regularly, almost daily. Right? And we selected them because we know that in chronic users, the response is quite different to an acute challenge with cannabis than the occasional users. And we did actually see that in our data. So if you look at the subjective levels of high, so they have to rate their own level of high, we see in both groups that they were actually increased. So they all reported high. So, but if you look at the impact of that acute cannabis dose on their level of attention, we see that there's impairment, but only in the occasional group, but not in the chronic users group, right? So that's interesting. So why is that? And if you look at the spectroscopy data, then we see that at the striatal level, there's this increase in glutamate, but only in the occasional users. And we don't see that in the chronic users. So there's something happening in these occasional users that's not occurring in the chronic group. And if we look at the functional connectivity data, so functional connectivity of the nucleus accumbens, then what we typically see is that relative to the rest of the brain, there's this decrement in functional connectivity. And I think this is the right upper panel that you're looking at. So there's hardly any red coloring right over there. But we don't see any changes in functional connectivity in that chronic cannabis user groups. So these are the lower panels, right? Placebo versus THC. Hardly any change. And what was also interesting is that the changes in striatal glutamate were actually strongly correlated to the changes in functional connectivity. So somehow these are related, at least associated. So from this, we started thinking, okay, so how does that work in the mesocortical limbic system, right? What's changing? And that's what you're looking at here, at least the summary of the change. So to the left is the normal situation, and then the right, this is like the acute challenge with cannabis. And what happens is that there's this release of dopamine from the ventral tegmental area into the nucleus accumbens that drives the rest of the circuit. So it changes the GABAergic output, but it also changes the glutamatergic output, particularly from the thalamus into the prefrontal cortex and then into the hippocampus, for example. And there's a feedback loop in the end over here that actually goes back either to the striatum itself. That's why we find increased levels of glutamate. That's what we measure with spectroscopy. But it actually also goes back to the glutamatergic neurons that were responsible for the increase in dopamine to begin with. So it's kind of a reinforcing loop that takes care of this self-perpetuating effect that we were looking at. So this is our explanation of how we think that the neurotransmission is actually changing in that mesocortical limbic circuit. And in parallel to that, we have always measured that there's this decrease in functional connectivity in the same circuit, which is, and sometimes we call it the salience network or the reward network or the ventral attentional network. There's a big overlap between all of these systems. So that's our explanation of the acute effects, at least in occasional users, right? And as I mentioned, there was a difference between the two groups, and other labs have actually demonstrated that if you look at chronic users of cannabis, and some of them are hospitalized, because you want to help them go through their withdrawal, then typically what you find is that the CB1 receptors in the brain are strongly downregulated. But if you take them off cannabis for 3 weeks, you see the opposite. There's a strong upregulation again of the CB1 receptors, almost back to normal. So it's a very dynamic state, and now we're talking about neuroadaptations, right? So your brain is actually adapting to the fact that you're smoking cannabis every day and wants to restore the balance basically in the brain. And this is a study that was run in the United States, but we kind of collaborated in the sense that we also had the possibility to add some behavioral testing in that same group. And what we typically found was that at the baseline, so when they came into the hospital, right, when they just stopped their cannabis use, that their performance levels were actually quite bad, right? But over time, they actually improved, and that seems to coincide with the increase in CB1 receptor density over time. So we also think that there's a correlation, or at least a strong association, between these two phenomena. So I tried to sort of give you that schematically here. So in the left, there's the normal situation. I explained that. In the middle, there's the acute challenge of teaching in occasional users. But in chronic users, typically what you see is that because of the downregulation, the input into the ventral tegmental area is kind of normalized. And you would expect from that this also has an impact, for example, again, on the normal functioning within the mesocortical limbic system circuit, in the sense that the functional connectivity would also normalize again. But that would actually depend on the actual dynamics that are driving these changes in CB1 receptor density. And that leads us to the question, okay, so the brain adapts, and maybe you get tolerant to the cognitive effects, but how fast then does that happen? And it's interesting that if you dive into some of the old literature, like back in the 60s, when they were also doing a lot of this psychedelic research, there were studies where people were hospitalized for 3 weeks, and they were smoking cannabis around the clock. I couldn't even imagine that we would get permission to do that. But these studies were great in the sense that they taught us that tolerance actually develops really fast. And if you have somebody smoking cannabis every 4 hours, okay, they're also allowed to sleep, but when you wake up, you continue that. You see that the tolerance to the behavioral impairing effects actually decreases very rapidly within 24 hours. That's a very fast and dynamic process. And based on other data that we have, we actually predict that, depending on the type of user that you are, if you're an occasional user, you won't develop tolerance. You'll stay an occasional user. But if you're a daily user, you will develop tolerance. But if you adjust your smoking regime, then your brain will also adjust. So if you're a frequent or infrequent user, the chances of you developing tolerance will become less. Maybe partial tolerance, so it's a very dynamic state that can change depending on, you're sort of in control over that state yourself by deciding on how and when and how often you will smoke. So to make it even, I don't know, whether simpler or complex, this picture, but it's sort of trying to integrate all of the information. So with occasional users, on the upper panel, you see the placebo conditions. On the lower panel, you see the cannabis condition. So what we see that in the acute phase, there's this increase in dopamine, and there's this increase in glutamate, and it all concentrates in the striatum, and there you see the biggest changes. And that goes hand in hand with the decrement in the functional connectivity in the reward system, the mesocortical limbic system, which is the blue coloring there in the brain. But from that, you can also expect, okay, if you're a chronic user, then your CB1 receptors downregulate, which has this impact on the functional connectivity of the brain. Because if you're not intoxicated, then you're sort of under-adjusted, right? And then there's actually hyper connectivity in the mesocortical limbic system, but also in other parts of the brain. And in order to overcome that, you actually, the best advice would be to actually smoke cannabis, because that would normalize the entire neurotransmission within that circuit. I know it sounds like bad advice, but I think this is how it works to keep it sort of balanced. And that's not dissimilar to alcohol addicts, right? Who need a certain volume of alcohol every day to function normally. And I think we see the same happening here. But then if people abstain from cannabis use, it only takes a certain amount of time to actually go back to the normal baseline state. And then basically their response to an acute alcohol cannabis challenge would be the same as in occasional users again. So so there's this big difference between occasional users and chronic users. And one of the things that we were interested in was to dive in, this fingerprinting idea. Okay, can you recognize individuals or certain psychopathologies or states based on your entire connectome, and not just looking at the reward system, but the entire connectome. So this is a collaboration that we did with Enrico Amico, who's now working in Geneva in Switzerland. And so basically we collected the entire connectome, functional connectivity for the entire connectome, and Enrico ran an ICA on that data set. So to see whether there were any patterns that would come out of, differentiate from that we could relate to a behavioral outcome or a demographic outcome. Like, you're an occasional user, you're a chronic user, can we see a difference? And we actually did, and that's what you're seeing in this particular matrix. The diagonal basically are all the within network connections, right? Which indicate that there's hyperconnectivity, which is what we actually also see in our studies. So that's already a biomarker of your cannabis use history as such, which I think is interesting. And we found a similar, also less clear, but there was like one single pattern that was associated to the state of THC intoxication. So not necessarily impairment, but the intoxication state. And we are now sort of diving into this fingerprint a bit deeper to see whether we can also separate, the state of intoxication from the actual state of impairment. But that's the step that we still need to take, that want to take in the future. Right, and that was cannabis. Some people say cannabis is psychedelic. I don't believe that, but sometimes it's being called so. But the question the questions on neuromodulation and neuroadaptation in particular also actually are relevant in the realm of psychedelic research. And one of the questions I heard coming up already today also is, okay, if you see long-term changes with psychedelic, what's driving them, right? Is it psychology or is it biology? It could be both, of course. But it's one of the biggest debates, I think, at present. So there's this one group that thinks, okay, we don't need the psychedelic experience. We only need this change in neuroplasticity that is driving the changes over time. And others say, well, no, there is this psychedelic insight or experience as such. And there's actually some data showing that the strength of the experience is sort of associated with the improvement in systems of depression, for example. Also, I must admit, more and more I see studies coming out that don't find that particular association. But that's debate. The debate, and we don't have a definitive answer to it. But these are interesting debates, and that raise interesting questions too, that we are interested in as well. And so I want to switch to one of the studies. Natasha actually did a study in our lab, so where we had a study where people received a single dose of psilocybin, just about 14 milligrams. That was body weight adjusted, but that was the overall mean. And we were interested in the psychedelic experience as such, because it might be a driver of therapeutic outcome. And we used several scales for that, some of the validated ones. And the one that we're looking at here is the 5 tasks and the 5 key dimensions that are associated with that. So things like oceanic boundlessness, anxious ego dissolution, the visual restructuralization, auditive effects or effects on arousal and vigilance. And as expected, of course, you see that these increase a lot, particularly oceanic boundlessness, but also anxious ego dissolution and visual effects increase quite a lot. And in that particular study, we looked at a couple of things. And one of them was actually spectroscopy. So we put seeds, like big voxels of 3 by 3 centimeters, in the hippocampus and in the medial prefrontal cortex, right? And they're all sort of part of the default mode network, which is so important in our field. And we were interested to see how levels of glutamate would actually change and whether there would be differences between these two regions. And typically what we see, and that's, you see that here on the right, so for psilocybin, there's a decrease in glutamate in the, is it the other way around? I'm looking into the small, so for psilocybin, there's an increase, right, in the medial prefrontal cortex, yeah, and there's a decrease in the hippocampus. And when you sort of try to associate and correlate those to the subjective changes, then what you find is that oceanic boundlessness, the change in oceanic boundlessness and ego dissolution, they're actually associated to the decrements that you see in glutamate in the hippocampus. But if you look at the regional changes in glutamate in the medial prefrontal cortex, you see that it's solely associated to the anxious ego dissolution. So it's almost as if we're sort of tracing or separating the good psychedelic experience from the bad psychedelic experience. Which is interesting, because that learns us a lot about what is driving that psychedelic experience to begin with. We also had some functional connectivity data in that particular same study, where we were interested in the dynamics. So this is the neuromodulation, right? And so we have this resting state data set. It's about 10 minutes or a bit less. And what studies have shown already a couple of times is that if you look at the networks, the major network, that there's this decrement in within network connectivity, particularly the DMN, but there's also this increase in between network connectivities. And the networks actually vary quite a lot from study to study, but that is like a general thing that people always find. And we were interested to see whether this is like a fixed state or whether this is an alternating state and how that is actually related to the psychedelic experience as such. So this is a collaboration with the group of the Giga group in Liège. And they, by using the dynamic functional connectivity approaches, they identified 4 stages basically. And one of them is probably the most important one, which is stage 3 here, which is this state of hyperconnectivity, which other people have reported in a static functional connectivity profile. And typically what we found using that analysis, that the occurrence rates of certain states actually increased under psilocybin. So this pattern 3 of hyperconnectivity is most prevalent under psilocybin if you compare that to placebo. And also if you look at the alterations, so how often are these states switching from one to the other or from itself to itself, you see that there's a lot of change, and that this hyperconnectivity state is sort of centralized in the entire experience, because most of the transitions are going back to that particular state. And if you then correlate a vector of these transitions to a factor of the psychedelic state, you actually find that these transition states predict the magnitude of your psychedelic effect. So it's an interesting way or method to sort of link a change, a neuromodulation in your brain to the actual subjective experience of psilocybin. Here again, study from Natasha, same study actually, but other data, where we were looking at creativity. And here it's more about, the question is more about neuroadaptation, right? Because apart from therapeutic benefits that we see in patient population, we also have reports from healthy volunteers that they improve either in mood or in cognitive function, or that's claimed primarily, right, or in creativity. Right? That's one of the nice claims that are sort of floating over the psychedelic field, that people get more creative. So we were interested in that, and we had a couple of ways of measuring creativity. And there's a kind of a couple of standard tests, but we use 3 of them. And that you see depicted here, so the PCT, the picture concept task, we had the auditory, alternative uses task, and we had the instantaneous, spontaneous insights. And what we typically see is that acutely there's this increase in spontaneous insights, right? But if you look at the longer term, people actually perform less, for example, on the PCT. And if you try to associate these behavioral changes in creativity, you see that the acute effects were primarily associated with changes within the default mode network, so this reduction in functional connectivity. But the longer term effects, they were actually more related to this increase of connectivities between brain areas at all. So again, it is possible to sort of distinguish the acute effect from the longer term effects, even though you're looking at the brain in the acute state. So it would be interesting to actually do the same thing, but maybe like a week later when you have the subchronic state of the brain, which you haven't defined very well yet.
Yeah. The insight, is it subjective insight, or is it you give them an insight task and they solve it?
It's subjective, spontaneous insight, but what people report, yeah. So I mentioned that we collaborate with Amanda Fielding. So one of the studies we recently completed was a repeated microdosing study where we had 2 groups. One group received 4 doses of 15 micrograms of LSD spread over 2 weeks, so like 3 days in between. And the other group was randomly assigned to receive a placebo treatment. We had a baseline that we measured a week before, and we had a follow-up meeting a week later. So the entire study duration was 4 weeks, but in the middle, the second and the third week were the active weeks, where you either receive your treatment or your placebo. And we had a couple of neural indicators or potential neural indicators of the drug effect, and they were all EEG or EEP measures. So here we were interested in spontaneous EEG or resting state EEG, where we looked at all the frequency bands. And we know already from other work that also at higher doses, there are changes in these lower frequency bands in particular, maybe alpha frequency, mostly in particular. And these are usually decreased in terms of amplitude. And we see actually the same thing happening here with a microdose on the acute days. And here you're looking at the baseline, the first dose, 4th dose, that's when we took our measurement, and during the follow-up. And typically what we see is that there's this indication of stimulation. Right? This is a very typical effect for stimulatory compounds. Amphetamines would do actually the same. And we see those very strongly when people have taken a first dose or the 4th dose, but some of these effects actually linger on over time. So even during the follow-up session, we saw this decrement in delta wave activity. It was much less than during the actual acute days, but it still was there, and it turned up significant. And we were also interested in the individual variation. So so what defines somebody as a responder, and what defines somebody as a non-responder? So we were looking at the level of arousal that people had during the baseline. And typically what you find is that those who have low arousal states, so that are high in amplitude, and on alpha or theta or delta, they actually benefited the most. So the increase in arousal was the highest in these particular subjects. And well, that's also interesting, I think, because that can explain in part also why it's so hard sometimes to find changes in behavior in microdosing studies, because there's a lot of inter-individual variation. We also used a mismatch negativity task where we look at the mismatch negativity, but also the P3A, or particularly the differences was of interest. What we found there in particular is that the peak of the MMN actually occurred earlier, so that's an indication that pre-attentive states are more alert. So again, pointing in the direction of the stimulatory effect. And the following P3A peak was actually bigger in its amplitude, attesting to the same thing. And we found this particularly on the dosing days, but even some of those effects we actually also found on the follow-up days. So indicating that neurally, some change actually did occur. Whether that is relevant at a behavior level, of course, we do not know, but it does indicate that there are neural changes that are indicating that there's neuroadaptation going on, even 1 week after only 4 doses. Yeah.
What was the dose?
15 micrograms, 4 times. Yeah, so the question always is, what is the microdose, right? Where does it begin? Where does it end? On 10, I think everybody would agree it's a microdose. In this case, people did notice it sometimes, but we asked people on each of the dosing days to indicate, what treatment do you think that you received, right? And typically what you see is that about 60%, or a bit less, I think like, 58 or so %, they guessed correctly in each of the treatment conditions. But if you look at the distribution, that wasn't actually not significant. And what we saw a lot in the LSD condition is that on dosing day 1, they would say, nah, placebo. But on dosing day 4, it was, nah, it's LSD. Or the other way around. So they didn't know, right? That's an indication. So I think actually in this particular study, it was kind of well blinded, which is for a psychedelic study quite unique. But of course you need to go very low with your dose. Then okay, the ayahuasca study. That's what I want to talk about a bit more now, because this is the study that we're sharing data with your group as well. And it's also a kind of interesting study because we were approached by the Santo Daime Church at some point. When they ran into legal problems in the Netherlands, and they just, they contacted us and said, look, take our brain, scan our brain. I'm sure something beautiful will come from that. And we got interested, but of course it's problematic in a sense that if you want to do controlled studies, it's very difficult to sort of administer ayahuasca to, in a controlled setting. Your IRB will not like it, in other words. And of course, they want to drink their own brew. They're responsible for their own brew. They get it from the Amazon. They have been working on it quite often themselves. And the constellation of that brew, differs always, right? It's like, like a fruitcake. If you bake it, it's different than when I bake it, but there's always this variation. So we had a long conversation with the IRB on the idea that we could posit this as an observational study, meaning that the Santo Daime Church would be responsible for the administration of ayahuasca and the drinking of it. And once they were done, we would take over as the responsible party. So, and they agreed to that. So we had, basically, we have an hotel just opposite our scanning facilities, and that's where they stayed during the weekends. So on Saturday, they would come. We would have 6 people per weekend, and we would scan them back to back. So we have this time schedule so that you will all fit. On Saturdays, there was our reference day or baseline day. And on Sunday, they would have a drinking schedule. Right? And everybody could determine on their own how much they drank, because they just drank as usual, but there was a lot of variation in that. And in the beginning of the Sunday morning, they would actually have their Santo Daime ritual, right? They would have like these small masses. They would sing, they would dance, they would pray, they would meditate, to get in the, almost in the desired setting, which I normally use to get into the desired state. So, and we used resting state fMRI, we collected spectroscopy, we collected blood, and otherwise, these are very experienced users. So on average, the mean use was 563 times. That's the average use. I can't recall what the variance, but it was really, really wide. So most of them had been a member of the church for at least 7 years, and others for 20 years or so. So they really had a lot of experience. So in that sense, it's not a very representative sample, of course, but an interesting nonetheless. So here you see the Daime brew that we used. So they brought it themselves. they had their small, like rituals that they needed to get into their desired states, including the dancing and the singing. So we took a sample of the daima to get an indication of what's actually in there, right? And how the ratio of the harmolines relative to the DMT. So that's what you see depicted down here. Yeah, and then they were basically good to go. So we had the ceremony in the morning, then you had the drinking schedule. They were all 90 minutes apart. So we have to put them back to back into the scanner. And we had this small device to measure how much people actually drank, right? Because that's important. And it differed quite a lot. And on average, the dose was about 22 milliliters of daime, but you can see that in the very left, like all these individual dots, they differ a lot. So the highest dose was like 41 milliliters, but we also had people that drank like 10, so 4 times as large. So there was a lot of variation in there. And if we look at the concentrations of daime in the blood, so we had the blood analyzed for concentration of DMT and some of the harmolines. These are depicted here. And you also see that there's a lot of individual variation, right? If you look at these individual dots, which is also a well-known phenomenon. If you give people a fixed dose, you shouldn't expect the same concentration of that same drug in every individual. There's a lot of variation always. And in this particular case, it's also not a big surprise that we don't find any correlation at all between the actual dose that people drink and the concentration of either DMT or harmolines in their blood. But they did achieve, all of them, the psychedelic state. Again, measured with the 5-desk depicted here. So you have again these 5 dimensions: oceanic boundlessness, anxious ego dissolution, the visual effects, the auditory effects, and effects on a state of vigilance and arousal. And the EDI is the ego dissolution inventory, which is kind of similar to the measure of oceanic boundlessness, I would say. So particularly EDI, oceanic boundlessness, and the visual effects were quite increased. And when we looked at the changes in their psychedelic state, we found that they were also strongly correlated to the level of DMT in your blood. So DMT actually is driving the psychedelic experience quite a lot, and particularly for those dimensions, right? Oceanic boundlessness, the visual effects, and also the ego dissolution inventory changes were strongly correlated. We also were interested in the impact of ayahuasca on mental imagery. So it's almost related to this creativity idea, right? Do people become more flexible, for example? So we looked at a number of tasks where we measure perspective switching, or the vividness. We tried to rate the vividness of the imagery, or their subjective experience of cognitive flexibility. And we had this chain-free association word task to see whether people could actually, would be more adequate in sort of making connections between words. And we found not a whole lot of effects on any of these measures, except for cognitive flexibility, which actually decreased, which is not unsurprising, Jung acute state at least. It may change later on. But we did find some correlation between DMT levels and task performance. Even though at a group level, right, we didn't always clearly see changes at the individual level, we still found these associations between perspective shifting and DMT levels in the blood. And the same was true for cognitive flexibility. So again, indicating that if there is any change at these mental imagery facilities, then they are affected by levels of DMT in blood. And then we arrive at the work that Pablo has been doing in our lab, again in collaboration with Enrico Amico. And here we were interested in to use functional connectivity data to make a fingerprint of the individual. Fingerprinting has been used to sort of indicate or determine, or identify a state of psychopathology. But it can also be used to use as an individual fingerprint in a way. And in this study, we were interested to see whether under the influence of ayahuasca, people would become more similar to themselves in a way, or more similar to others that were also drinking ayahuasca. And we did that by splitting up the resting state data in two parts, like the first part and the second part. It's as easy as that. And you correlate the data, the time series in the first part, with that in the second part. And then you look at the correlations of those. I think I just explained that. So, and then you have measures. So if you correlate the time series of a person's first and second half, then you have this measure which you call I-self. But you can also correlate the time series of an individual to that of others that have been drinking, and that's your signature of how similar are you to others, and that's the I-others measure that we are using here. And so in the I-self, you have the baseline condition, so that's the Saturday. You have the ayahuasca condition, that's when they drank. We have the hybrid condition. That's basically where you're comparing your time series, for example, of the first half under ayahuasca to the time series of the second half on a placebo. Right? And what you see is that the I-self component during placebo, if you compare it within placebo, it's not changing. And if you compare it within ayahuasca, it's also not changing. But if you do a cross measurement, you see actually that, and that's the hybrid measure, that is actually changing a lot. So you become more dissimilar from your own signature during placebo. But the interesting part was when we compared these fingerprints to the others that were also part of the experiment, which is I-others. And in the placebo, of course, you have the reference value, but relative to the placebo in the ayahuasca condition, you see actually that the similarity to others increases, right? It doesn't decrease, but it increases. And then there's this other measure that you call IDIF, and that basically indicates how distinguishable you become from others. And in this case, it actually says you become less distinguishable from others. And that's an interesting finding, and we thought about this long, and also how to explain it and what it actually means. We came up with this visual graphic here that Pablo also made to sort of explain what it is that we're looking at. And here we have every individual in the placebo condition dressed up in its own individual T-shirt, right? They all have different colors. And but if they go into the ayahuasca condition, they're all changing gear and all wearing the same color. So that sort of visually explains that if you look at how you self relate to others, you become more similar because you're wearing the same clothes. And in the placebo condition, of course, that we do not see. The big discussion that we had is, okay, if people become more similar to each other on the ayahuasca, what's causing that? Is it the fact that I actually drank ayahuasca? Is it just a drug-related effect, or is it more than that? And we always thought that it was more than that, because people were using ayahuasca in a ritualistic setting. They were using the same protocols, the same rituals, the same settings to achieve that common space, which they would normally do if they drink ayahuasca in the church environment. But of course, that's hard to prove in a context like this. And also, this was not communal use, right? We had individual drinking at their own each individual times, and we scanned them individually. But still, we find this a fact. So we still believe it's based on the fact that people use a kind of a protocol to get to the desired state of mind, and that's why they have become more similar. But of course, we cannot prove that based on this simple study alone. So we looked at another data set, the data set that Natasha collected, our psilocybin data set, to do the same analysis. But this is a between group design, so in that respect, it is different. And here, we actually find the opposite. So here you have a study where individuals do not know each other. They all participate in the study, but they don't know each other. They don't have any group rituals or common protocols at all. And what you typically see is that they actually become less similar from each other. They become more dissimilar, right? So more individualized in a way. So indirectly, we think that this is indicating that our first sort of interpretation of the data of the ayahuasca that actually does indicate that the setting, the rituals that people use to drink ayahuasca actually colors the fingerprint of that experience quite a lot. But probably that remains open to debate, but so we sort of believe in it. And almost to my last slide. So fingerprinting is something that we like a lot and that we want to continue working on also in the future. And we are setting up this framework now where we will have a couple of compounds of interest, and I think I'll list them here. So a lot of them are psychedelics or related to psychedelics. So we have a group of phenethylamines, for which we now have collected functional cognitivity data, resting state data, so MDMA, but also 2CP. Pablo collected these data. We have now a group of tryptamines, so we have the psilocybin data, we have the DMT data, and we're about to complete a set on cannabinoids. We already have the cannabis data. We will collect data for JWH018, which is a synthetic cannabinoid. So, but apart from the brain imaging data, we are also collecting blood data, and that's where metabolomics comes into play, because the fingerprinting principle that you can apply to brain imaging data, you can actually also apply to blood data, in the sense that you can look at all the metabolites that that are relevant into the brain, the building blocks, the metabolites that all come from that. That gives you access to like 300 parameters in total. And we've done some preliminary work on this already for the ayahuasca data set to see if there's any like common fingerprint that is relevant also to the psychedelic experience. And the three parts that actually stood out are encircled here, which is comes as no surprise. There's serotonergic markers actually increase quite a lot. That makes sense because we know the psychedelics work through 5-HT2 receptor in the brain. And we also see that there was a kind of a downregulation of dopaminergic and noradrenergic parameters in the blood. And most surprising was there was a lot of change in the endocannabinoid system. And we know that there's an interaction somehow between 5-HT2 receptors and CB1. Exactly how it works, we don't know. We also do not know whether it is relevant for the psychedelic experience as such, because we have a lot of CB1 receptors also peripherally. But that's but that we have to find out. So in the end, our ultimate goal here is to have brain fingerprints and have blood fingerprints and be able to predict based on a blood fingerprint how functionally, first identify a drug. I think that would be the first idea to go with. So can we tell from a fingerprint in blood, okay, this is like a cannabis-like compound, or this is like an MDMA-like compound, or this is like psilocybin? And based on that, do like a valid prediction also on how these compounds, particularly when they're unknown and new introduced on the market, how these would actually affect brain function or cognition or function cognitively. But for that, I probably have to come back, Morten, in I don't know, 5 years or so. And with that, I thank you very much.
Wow, thank you for that tour de force.
Yeah.
It's really exciting. So I'm sure there are lots of questions. Do we want to, maybe you can monitor them, no, you can't monitor them online, but I can monitor them from here. Anybody in the room that have a question? Kenneth, if we start with you.
Yes, thank you for the excellent talk. I was just wondering if you could clarify the difference between tonic and phasic therapy.
Yeah. So the phasic dopamine is like a temporary release to a stimulus, and that is short lasting. And the tonic levels are longer lasting. It's almost like a baseline dopamine level that is present and surrounding your neurons. Okay.
Anybody else? I'm fascinated by this result of the of course the ayahuasca and psilocybin, these fingerprints. I mean, do you want to speak a little bit more to what you actually think it means? I mean, talk a little bit about how you. I mean, what is the role of music in that?
Yeah, so what I think is that the psychedelic experience of all the individuals was steered, was directed by using a standardized protocol. And in this case, they have their own rituals, like praying and singing and dancing, meditating. But I think it could be any protocol. It could also be music that drives people in the same direction or attunes their attention in similar ways. I think that's basically what we were looking at in the sense of this communal fingerprint that all of a sudden pops out. And I think you will only find it if individuals are actually attuned in the same way. Perhaps you can do that with a drug alone. I don't know. I think in this case, it's more than that.
So there's an intriguing set of studies you probably know where they use films. So there's a famous example of, the good, the bad, and the ugly, where they basically try to measure how synchronous brains are as they see the same movie. And of course, you find there's a very strong correlation between the different brains because they've been driven in the same way.
Yeah.
But there, of course, you've got a stimulus-bound thing, right? It's almost like the music puts you in the same frame of mind.
Yeah, exactly.
And therefore, when you accept the drop into your body, your brain is being primed in a certain way.
Yeah. And they've been using this ritual over and over again, right, to achieve the desired psychedelic state together in a communal setting. So it will be even more interesting to actually repeat that study with EEG, right, at an actual church meeting. Say, I don't know, 20 people, 30, right?
No, to have more. That was, of course, the next suggestion is what does it look like when you actually try to look at them synchronized or desynchronized? But of course, it raises many questions around the issue of social cognition and the role that drugs have in those, yes? I mean, would you predict that the same thing would happen if you say you had a ritual where you had, say, MDMA involved? I mean, I could think of certain raves where that would happen.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I mean, or even with the cannabinoids.
Yeah. No, I think so. If you were to repeat that same study, and maybe even in the same participant, but gave them psilocybin instead of ayahuasca, I would predict that the results would be similar.
Okay, well, I mean, that's a strong prediction right there.
Yeah,
an interesting one, right?
Yeah.
So in other words, there's a famous quote by Pasteur which says, "Chance favors the prepared mind."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He used it in the context of how do you see patterns in things, and if you have prepared yourself to be able to look at things in the right way, then of course you're able to see things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I think that's usually something that could be investigated and disturbs investigation, both on the individual level, but also on a group level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
That's a good question.
I was wondering, thank you for the talk, it's very interesting. I was wondering if the measures you're using for fingerprinting, is it just functional connectivity and metabolics, or have you explored other things?
So for the imaging data, yes, it is based on functional connectivity. The metabolomics data, we're looking at different approaches, but principal component analysis is one, for example, that stands out at the moment, that seems to work quite well. It becomes more difficult to sort of combine these huge data sets. So I think at the moment, we're primarily trying to reduce the complexity of the data set to actually get grip on them. And that's quite challenging on its own. Yeah. I think you was first.
I didn't quite catch that.
Yeah, fascinating talk, amazing. I'm just going back to this very interesting study on increasing tonic dopamine levels with Ritalin, and then having that gambling or reward study. I thought, what was interesting was that you got decrease in phasic dopamine for games, but what was really interesting was that the losses caused massively more decrease. So this was very painful to make the loss and also painful to make a gain.
Yeah.
So it feels like this is a perfect thing for gambling addiction.
Yeah.
Did you have a look at that? Or?
No, we didn't follow up on this work. Maybe we should. I mean, we talked about, right, would it be a way to actually use this in a psychedelic realm, right, to actually treat priors with a pharmacological treatment.
Well, it's I mean, for drug addiction you can see, but
Yeah.
but you know,
And gambling also,
for
yeah.
the gambling you see, it means that you know there's really a lot of pain,
Yeah.
and then there's a little bit of pain
Yeah.
if you win. I mean, what's
I
fascinating?
mean, one interesting question could also be, because now we manipulate the tonic dopamine levels, right, with you know, with a drug, right? But the question is, can we also alter it with a psychological mechanism? Because there's always this interaction. So if you can actually, if you were able to manipulate expectancy levels, just you know, on a cognitive level, that I wouldn't be surprised if that also impacted on your biological reflection of that, which is that tonic dopamine level. And that would, of course, be ideal, that somehow you can set the tonic levels without using drugs, because there's always the risk of addiction that follows from that, that you find another means to actually increase, to change, and to control expectancies that people have. And that's where you get into the, I don't know, maybe it's psychotherapy.
So through psychotherapy or through environmental interactions?
Yeah, particularly how people cope is environmental interaction, I would think. Yeah, you see it a lot in addiction that you know people are treated for a while, right? But as soon as they get out of the clinic, they are exposed to all of these cues. Again, it can be their environment, their friends who are using drugs, but you know, even marketing cues. And that they fall back into their habits, and and these are the habits that we should try to break.
I mean, I'm just wondering whether this could account for this interesting finding that you had, where you had a whole lot of addicted soldiers in Vietnam in the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And so when they came back home and in a nice environment, a lot of them just stopped being
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And you find this is similar with rats, where
Yeah.
you have rats in a fun environment, play environment, where they don't get so addicted to it.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah. I think it's a very important principle that probably also generalizable. But you know, we talked about it, but I think it probably also is generalizable to the psychedelic field, where you're treating depression, and where also one of the core symptoms underlying the psychopathology is really like the rigidity of thinking, of falling back in old patterns, and the chances of actually that occurring increase if you go back to your old environment, where you say the same cues, the same people, the same situation all over again, and you get desensitized, maybe even for the psychedelic effect at some point, right? Yeah.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you.
Other questions? I think we'll thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you very much.